My fellow citizens, this government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature last Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., I directed that our surveillance be stepped up. And having now confirmed and completed our evaluation of the evidence and our decision on a course of action, this government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail. The characteristic of these new missile sites indicate two distinct types of installations. Several of them include medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles. Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States, in Central America, or in the Caribbean area. Additional sites not yet completed appear to be designed for intermediate range ballistic missiles capable of traveling more than twice as far and thus capable of striking most of the major cities in the Western Hemisphere, ranging as far north as Hudson's Bay, Canada, and as far south as Lima, Peru. In addition, jet bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons are now being uncrated and assembled in Cuba, while the necessary air bases are being prepared. This urgent transformation of Cuba into an important strategic base by the presence of these large, long-range, and clearly offensive weapons of sudden mass destruction constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas, in flagrant and deliberate defiance of the Rio Pact of 1947, the traditions of this nation and hemisphere, the joint resolution of the 87th Congress, the Charter of the United Nations, and my own public warnings to the Soviets on September 4th and 13th. This action also contradicts the repeated assurances of Soviet spokesmen, both publicly and privately delivered, that the arms buildup in Cuba would retain its original defensive character, and that the Soviet Union had no need or desire to station strategic missiles on the territory of any other nation. The size of this undertaking makes clear that it has been planned for some months. Yet only last month, after I had made clear the distinction between any introduction of ground-to-ground missiles and the existence of defensive anti-aircraft missiles, the Soviet government publicly stated on September 11th that, and I quote, "The armaments and military equipment sent to Cuba are designed exclusively for defensive purposes," unquote. That there is, and I quote the Soviet government, "there is no need for the Soviet government to shift its weapons for a retaliatory blow to any other country, for instance, Cuba," unquote. And that, and I quote the government, "the Soviet Union has so powerful rockets to carry these nuclear warheads that there is no need to search for sites for them beyond the boundaries of the Soviet Union," unquote. That statement was false. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, "pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba," unquote. That, and I quote him, "training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive, and that if it were otherwise," Mr. Gromyko went on, "the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance," unquote. That statement also was false. Neither the United States of America nor the world community of nations can tolerate deliberate deception and offensive threats on the part of any nation, large or small. We no longer live in a world where only the actual firing of weapons represents a sufficient challenge to a nation's security to constitute maximum peril. Nuclear weapons are so destructive and ballistic missiles are so swift that any substantially increased possibility of their use or any sudden change in their deployment may well be regarded as a definite threat to peace. For many years, both the Soviet Union and the United States, recognizing this fact, have deployed strategic nuclear weapons with great care, never upsetting the precarious status quo, which ensured that these weapons would not be used in the absence of some vital challenge. Our own strategic missiles have never been transferred to the territory of any other nation under a cloak of secrecy and deception. And our history, unlike that of the Soviets since the end of World War II, demonstrates that we have no desire to dominate or conquer any other nation or impose our system upon its people. Nevertheless, American citizens have become adjusted to living daily on the bullseye of Soviet missiles located inside the USSR or in submarines. In that sense, missiles in Cuba add to an already clear and present danger. Although it should be noted, the nations of Latin America have never previously been subjected to a potential nuclear threat. But this secret, swift, extraordinary buildup of communist missiles in an area well known to have a special and historical relationship to the United States and the nations of the Western Hemisphere, in violation of Soviet assurances and in defiance of American and hemispheric policy, this sudden, clandestine decision to station strategic weapons for the first time outside of Soviet soil is a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo, which cannot be accepted by this country if our courage and our commitments are ever to be trusted again by either friend or foe. The 1930s taught us a clear lesson. Aggressive conduct, if allowed to go unchecked and unchallenged, ultimately leads to war. This nation is opposed to war. We are also true to our word. Our unswerving objective, therefore, must be to prevent the use of these missiles against this or any other country, and to secure their withdrawal or elimination from the Western Hemisphere. Our policy has been one of patience and restraint, as befits a peaceful and powerful nation which leads a worldwide alliance. We have been determined not to be diverted from our central concerns by mere irritants and fanatics. But now further action is required, and it is underway, and these actions may only be the beginning. We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the course of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced. Acting, therefore, in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. First, to halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. This quarantine will be extended, if needed, to other types of cargo and carriers. We are not at this time, however, denying the necessities of life, as the Soviets attempted to do in their Berlin blockade of 1948. Second, I have directed the continued and increased close surveillance of Cuba and its military buildup. The foreign ministers of the OAS, in their communique of October 6, rejected secrecy on such matters in this hemisphere. Should these offensive military preparations continue, thus increasing the threat to the hemisphere, further action will be justified. I have directed the armed forces to prepare for any eventualities, and I trust that in the interest of both the Cuban people and the Soviet technicians at the sites, the hazards to all concerned of continuing this threat will be recognized. Third, it shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. Fourth, as a necessary military precaution, I have reinforced our base at Guantanamo, evacuated today the dependents of our personnel there, and ordered additional military units to be on a standby alert basis. Fifth, we are calling tonight for an immediate meeting of the Organization of Consultation under the Organization of American States to consider this threat to hemispheric security and to invoke Articles 6 and 8 of the Rio Treaty in support of all necessary action. The United Nations Charter allows for regional security arrangements, and the nations of this hemisphere decided long ago against the military presence of outside powers. Our other allies around the world have also been alerted. Sixth, under the Charter of the United Nations, we are asking tonight that an emergency meeting of the Security Council be convoked without delay to take action against this latest Soviet threat to world peace. Our resolution will call for the prompt dismantling and withdrawal of all offensive weapons in Cuba under the supervision of UN observers before the quarantine can be lifted. Seventh and finally, I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. He has an opportunity now to move the world back from the abyss of destruction by returning to his government's own words that it had no need to station missiles outside its own territory and withdrawing these weapons from Cuba, by refraining from any action which will widen or deepen the present crisis, and then by participating in a search for peaceful and permanent solutions. This nation is prepared to present its case against the Soviet threat to peace and our own proposals for a peaceful world at any time and in any forum, in the OAS, in the United Nations, or in any other meeting that could be useful, without limiting our freedom of action. We have in the past made strenuous efforts to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. We have proposed the elimination of all arms and military bases in a fair and effective disarmament treaty. We are prepared to discuss new proposals for the removal of tensions on both sides, including the possibilities of a genuinely independent Cuba, free to determine its own destiny. We have no wish to war with the Soviet Union, for we are a peaceful people who desire to live in peace with all other peoples. But it is difficult to settle or even discuss these problems in an atmosphere of intimidation. That is why this latest Soviet threat, or any other threat, which is made either independently or in response to our actions this week, must and will be met with determination. Any hostile move anywhere in the world against the safety and freedom of peoples to whom we are committed, including in particular the brave people of West Berlin, will be met by whatever action is needed. Finally, I want to say a few words to the captive people of Cuba, to whom this speech is being directly carried by special radio facilities. I speak to you as a friend, as one who knows of your deep attachment to your fatherland, as one who shares your aspirations for liberty and justice for all. And I have watched, and the American people have watched, with deep sorrow, how your nationalist revolution was betrayed, and how your fatherland fell under foreign domination. Now your leaders are no longer Cuban leaders, inspired by Cuban ideals. They are puppets and agents of an international conspiracy which has turned Cuba against your friends and neighbors in the Americas and turned it into the first Latin American country to become a target for nuclear war, the first Latin American country to have these weapons on its soil. These new weapons are not in your interest. They contribute nothing to your peace and well-being. They can only undermine it. But this country has no wish to cause you to suffer or to impose any system upon you. We know that your lives and land are being used as pawns by those who deny your freedom. Many times in the past, the Cuban people have risen to throw out tyrants who destroyed their liberty. And I have no doubt that most Cubans today look forward to the time when they will be truly free, free from foreign domination, free to choose their own leaders, free to select their own system, free to own their own land, free to speak and write and worship without fear or degradation. And then shall Cuba be welcomed back to the society of free nations and to the associations of this hemisphere. My fellow citizens, let no one doubt that this is a difficult and dangerous effort on which we have set out. No one can foresee precisely what course it will take, or what costs or casualties will be incurred. Many months of sacrifice and self-discipline lie ahead, months in which both our patience and our will be tested, months in which many threats and denunciations will keep us aware of our dangers. But the greatest danger of all would be to do nothing. The path we have chosen for the present is full of hazards, as all paths are. But it is the one most consistent with our character and courage as a nation and our commitments around the world. The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender or submission. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved. Thank you, and good night.
This is a special report from CBS News, the Cuban crisis.
Good evening, everybody. This is Douglas Edwards speaking from CBS News headquarters in New York. You've just heard the President of the United States deliver an address to the nation about the crisis in Cuba. The speech ended more than a 2 full day time of speculation about what extraordinary action the President was about to take. Now he has spoken, and we know that this nation is imposing a naval quarantine on Cuba, that the United States is going to turn back any ships carrying weapons of an offensive nature to Cuba. He dealt at length with the nature of the military buildup in Cuba, citing the fact that bases are being built in Cuba for rockets and missiles, making Cuba a threat to the whole Western Hemisphere. The president castigated the Soviet Union for supplying Cuba in this new military buildup and asked Russia to stop arming Castro's Cuba. The president did not order any direct military action at this time, even though a buildup in the Caribbean area had been apparent all weekend. For more about this presidential decision on the Cuban crisis, here now is our chief Washington correspondent, David Schonbrun.
There are three major centers of activity that will be busy all through the night here in Washington: the White House itself and the two departments of government most directly concerned, State and Defense. We'll have reports on what's going on in each of those key areas, but first, perhaps we might briefly summarize the 7 main points of President Kennedy's message, stating that the Soviet buildup in Cuba is a threat to all of the Americans. He said that he is ordering the following initial measures, with others possible later. First, a quarantine of all ships carrying offensive military equipment to Cuba. Any ship found carrying such a cargo will be turned back. Secondly, continued close surveillance of the communist buildup in Cuba to see if any further action is needed, and an order to the armed forces to prepare for any eventuality. Thirdly, the use of nuclear missiles from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere will be considered as a Soviet attack upon the United States, requiring retaliatory action against the Soviet Union. Fourth, the American base at Guantanamo is being reinforced, additional units are standing by, and all dependents are being evacuated. Fifth, the convocation of the nations of the Organization of American States to meet and consider this threat to all of the Americas. Sixth, the President calls for an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council without delay to order the prompt dismantling and withdrawal of all offensive weapons in Cuba under the supervision of UN observers. Finally, the President calls upon Khrushchev to halt what he calls a reckless threat to world peace. Now, I think we're ready for our report from the White House. Let's switch there now to CBS News correspondent George Herman.
The excitement started here around mid-morning when it became known that the president had sent out word to his chief congressional leaders that he wanted them at the White House, wanted them so fast that in many cases he sent jet planes of the Air Force for them. He sent a jet plane for Everett Dirksen, campaigning in Illinois, and for Les Aarons in the same state. He sent jet planes for his chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Chairman Russell, and Chairman Vinson of the Senate and the House committees, both of them in Georgia. He sent a plane for Chairman Fulbright of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Activity began to mount here at the White House when Pierre Salinger suddenly came out around 12:30 and suggested that television cameramen set up their cameras right then in the fish room, the conference room, immediately across the hall from the president's own office. He suggested they might want to stay on the alert, standing by in case the president came out at any moment. That alert lasted until 4 o'clock this afternoon, and then it was canceled. Meantime, the president was having a busy schedule, conferring with the secretaries of state and of defense, with Llewellyn Thompson, his specialist on Soviet affairs, presumably soliciting his views on what the Russians would do in response to his speech, and talking to his chief of the Special Task Force on Berlin. Then the activity in the formal nature began. The president met at 3:15 with the National Security Council. At 4:30, a cabinet meeting. At 5 o'clock, finally, the line of congressional leaders discharged by a long row of black sedans which had brought them from airports and railroad stations. At 5 o'clock, that meeting began, the president conferring with the congressional leaders, telling them what he was going to do, congressional leaders of both houses and both parties. Finally, after that meeting, about 6:35, just 25 minutes before air, that meeting broke up. The president went on the air, delivered the statement you've just heard. That's the way it's gone here at the White House. This is CBS News at the White House.
Now that our correspondent at the Pentagon is ready for that report, so let's switch now to Roger Mudd.
The Pentagon, which has become Washington's most formidable establishment tonight, is a bright burning center of military planning, just within the evening shadows of the White House and the Washington Monument. All day long here on the Virginia side of the Potomac River, generals, admirals, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and their advisors have moved in and out of this sprawling building and through the bewildering complex of corridors, inner rings, and outer rings. In less than an hour, Pentagon reporters who are now assembling here will be called in for an off-the-record briefing, so familiar to Washington reporters, a briefing by a high-ranking Defense Department spokesman. It will be at this briefing, called for 8 o'clock this evening, that the Pentagon will lay down the specific military requirements needed to carry out the U.S. quarantine of Cuba. This is Roger Mudd at the Pentagon.
We received a call from our correspondents in the State Department while Roger Mudd was talking to us. They say that Undersecretary of State George Ball is preparing to meet with reporters to explain this action, and the Soviet Ambassador Dobrinin has been at the State Department to see Mr. Ball. All of our allies of the NATO nations have also been informed of the President's action, and they'll be meeting later tonight again with officials at the State Department. That's the situation as it is here in Washington right now. Now back to Douglas Edwards in New York.
Hours before Mr. Kennedy spoke, Havana Radio condemned this country for the military buildup in the Caribbean, saying that it was barefaced aggression, but the Cuban capital was reportedly calm. For a report from the United Nations on the reaction to tonight's presidential address there, here's CBS News correspondent Richard C. Hottelet.
Tension has been building up here at the UN like a big black cloud over this Cuban crisis, and now the reaction is likely to be, possibly paradoxically, one of relief, because the stories around here during the day had envisioned the possibility of armed attack, of air attack, of actual open war. Now we face a legal situation of quarantine, which is not even blockade, because blockade under international law is an act of war. There may also be some relief that the United States has exerted its power unilaterally. There have been none of the tedious and prolonged discussions and negotiations and weighing of rival interests that have taken place before earlier conferences like Punta del Este and the meeting of the foreign ministers in Washington 3 weeks ago. This time, the United States apparently decided to go ahead on its own strength and its own vital interests, and it can probably carry all its allies and friends with it. Some of the shipping countries like Britain and Greece and Norway and the others may not be terribly happy, but the chances are they'll go along. The Latin Americans, too, are expected to applaud success if it succeeds. As far as the Security Council goes, it will probably meet tomorrow morning, Adlai Stevenson trying to persuade them that this is not an act of war and should not lead to armed conflict, local or global in scale. The big question is how the Soviet Union chooses to respond. The UN Charter gives the Security Council primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. The Council determines the existence of any threat to the or breach of the peace and may order sanctions, including armed action against a nation it brands as an aggressor. The Soviet Union can be expected to veto the American resolution that's introduced. The United States can then go under the Uniting for Peace resolution to the General Assembly and probably get a good bit of support. If the Soviet Union tries to turn the Security Council against the United States, the chances are that it will not get anywhere near enough votes to carry. So in another way, the United Nations, this United Nations week, is being used as a major instrument of U.S. policy. Now back to Douglas Edwards.
And so the 2 days of waiting and guessing are over. The President has addressed the nation about what we intend to do about Cuba. He did not order any direct military action. He did not order a blockade. He ordered a naval quarantine that is not designed to keep normal consumer goods from the people of Cuba. The President went out of his way to address the Cuban people directly, saying he spoke to them as a friend, that he shares their aspirations and their hopes. He addressed them as a captive people no longer controlling their own destinies. There will be a special report on the CBS television network at 10:30 Eastern Daylight Time tonight on this development, and so the President has spoken out, told the world that we will not back down anywhere. Douglas Edwards reporting. Good night for now.
The Cuban crisis has been a special report from CBS News. This is the CBS Television Network.